In another little experiment, I'm going to try to do a book analysis. From the title, you'll know that this isn't The Great Gatsby or another 1920s book generally known. Instead, I chose An American Tragedy by Theodore Dreiser, published in 1925. While not super famous now, it's often ranked as one of the best pieces of American literature ever written, so it definitely shouldn't be written off. First, a little background on the author and the book. Theodore Dreiser was a pretty interesting guy. A random fun fact is that he very nearly boarded the Titanic for its fateful voyage. At the time An American Tragedy was published, Dreiser was in his 50s, and his career had been at a severe low point for several years. He had previously written 5 novels and a short story collection, but to little commercial success. Though the plots for those previous books sound really interesting, so let me know if you read any of his earlier works in the comments. Anyway, Dreiser started the manuscript in 1920, but eventually abandoned it, then took it up again 3 years later and published it in late 1925. Unlike his previous books, this one sold rather well, though didn't propel him to any legendary status or anything like that. I recently finished reading it, which took quite a bit of time considering my copy was over 850 pages. But I thought it was so interesting and so telling about 1920s culture that I thought I would make a little video on it. This one is going to be a little bit bare bones because I don't really know how to present this, but try and bear with me. I don't really want to film myself, so I'll just do what I normally do with less photos and videos. Yes, there are spoilers, but you've had 95 years to read it, so no excuses. Okay, on to the summary. The novel begins with our main character, Clyde Griffiths, growing up through his adolescent years. He was raised in a strict religious household with proselytizing evangelist parents, though he strays away from their teachings in search of pleasure and hedonism. He's able to get a job as a soda jerk, then upgrades to a bellboy at one of the finest hotels in Kansas City, and starts receiving a sizable paycheck and becomes friends with many of the other bellboys. Together, they seek pretty young women in and outside of brothels, engage in drinking parties and overall sinful fun. Clyde loves having more financial freedom and starts using it to spoil one of his crushes, who doesn't even really like him that much, but shows him attention because he lavishes her with gifts. He even goes so far as to make a down payment on a fur coat for her, despite it being way above his means. Even worse, he does this instead of helping to support his pregnant and abandoned sister. This is the first time Clyde is seduced and corrupted by money. After a night of partying and drinking, the group of bellboys and a few young women are involved in a hit and run that results in the death of a little girl, and they all flee from the police and start new lives in new cities, leaving 2 members of the group, a boy and a girl who were unconscious at the scene, to take all the punishment. Clyde makes his way to Chicago, leaving his family out of fear of being locked up for many years. By chance, he meets his rich uncle at the hotel he's working at and asks for a job at his collar factory. Clyde's father has virtually excommunicated himself from the family, including his rich brother, and Samuel Griffiths, the uncle, feels bad for Clyde as well as Clyde's father, whom Samuel feels was treated unfairly by their father. So Clyde moves to Lycurgus in upstate New York. Meanwhile, his cousin Gilbert Griffiths, the heir to the profitable factory business, is in charge of assigning Clyde his job. Gilbert is jealous and suspicious of Clyde since he was now a threat to his inheritance, so he assigns Clyde to the most menial job. But Samuel, his uncle, soon overrides this and Clyde is reassigned to a supervising position. Now Clyde begins to experience the wonders of a high social status. Even though he's only a nephew to the factory's wealthy owner, he still shares the family name that is held in such high esteem in the area. And even though his uncle had said that he wouldn't give Clyde preferential treatment, he does anyway by promoting him based entirely on his family connection. Clyde, however, is still immature, and still prone to seeking out the hedonistic pleasures in life, but especially women. He becomes romantically involved with one of the young women he supervises, a young woman named Roberta, despite this being strictly against the company's rules. After some fun, he becomes less interested in her in favor of a young, wealthy socialite named Sandra. He knows that Sandra can provide all the things he truly wants, money and status. Sandra really just wants him as a boy toy, though she is perfectly willing to marry him for that. But there's a problem, a big problem. It turns out that Clyde got Roberta pregnant, and back then it was a huge stain on your character to have a child out of wedlock, especially for women. But more importantly to Clyde, this would reveal that he had broken the company's rules, and he would almost definitely be fired and shunned by his rich relatives. Clyde and Roberta secretly try everything to terminate the pregnancy, pills of dubious quality, and trying to gather information about doctors that would perform illegal abortions, but nothing comes of it. Clyde becomes increasingly more desperate. He can see his future life of wealth and comfort disappearing just because of some pesky factory girl who was threatening to reveal the story out of necessity in return for forced financial compensation from Clyde because her family is dirt poor and would not be able to support a baby very well. He starts entertaining thoughts of getting rid of her, permanently, so he can finally achieve what he believes is true happiness. He finally makes up his mind to follow through with the plan, and tells Roberta he will marry her and put all of this behind them. He takes her to a quiet lake in a sparsely populated area with the intention of knocking her into the water with an oar, stunning her, and leaving her to drown, knowing that she can't swim. But when they're in the boat, he accidentally hits Roberta with his camera as she suddenly leans forward towards him, and capsizes the boat and she drowns. Clyde wonders if he will be blamed for it, or if it'll just be seen as an accidental death. But realizing the circumstances were too suspicious, he decides to flee the scene of the crime, committing himself to his own botched murder, thinking, or at least hoping, that he can get away with it. Clyde thought he had taken every possible precaution, even signing hotel registers under 2 different pseudonyms, though both using the same letters as his real initials, CG. It had all been premeditated. But the local coroner is able to figure out his real name very quickly by identifying Roberta from a letter in her pocket, then questioning her parents, and her mother said that she had only been seen with one young man recently, Clyde Griffiths. The coroner almost doesn't believe that Clyde was the true murderer because of how obvious the evidence was against him, that if he was the murderer, he was not a very bright one. So, to make a long story short, Clyde is eventually tried and convicted of murder, and is ultimately sent to the electric chair. There's not much use going into too much detail since like 100 pages of the book are dedicated to the trial and the circumstantial evidence gradually turning against Clyde. So that's the book in a nutshell. But what does it mean? What does it say about the 1920s? First, as I've said before in many of my videos, the 1920s was a time of relative prosperity, or at the very least, there were more eccentric people with a lot of money. But more importantly, there was a lot of new money, or people who had recently come into wealth by their own means. This made getting rich seem more within reach for ordinary people. And many young people seemed to be becoming obsessed with money and hedonistic activities almost to the point of absurdity. The wealthy, beautiful, and eccentric celebrities, especially in the film industry, were the idols of the youth, an ideal that young people wanted to achieve for themselves. With this plot, the novel could very well have been written as a satire, and the reader could enjoy themselves laughing at the misery Clyde brought upon himself. But Dreiser's tone remains serious throughout, which rules out satire. Nothing is too absurd. Clyde seems like he's bumbling and blundering around blindly in pursuit of wealth and status, but the serious tone and the way Clyde's flaws end up destroying him is what makes it a tragedy. When the drive to obtain those material riches becomes too intense, it will almost inevitably end in tragic failure, in Clyde's case, the ending of his own life. Dreiser might be critical of these kinds of people, but he's also somewhat sympathetic to their fate. Some have criticized the first part of the book about Clyde's childhood as being too long-winded and detailed, because it doesn't contribute to the overall plot. But I disagree, because it's necessary to understand Clyde's motivation and mindset. Why he behaves the way he does is extremely important for the overall message of the novel. Part of this has to do with morals and ethics. Clyde had been raised in a religious household that was too suffocating to be healthy. However, it had given him a strong moral code that, at the time, would definitely have been admirable in a young man. But because his parents had been too strict, this made him want to rebel, to go against their values. There is so much nuance here about raising children that may or may not be completely intentional. A good foreshadowing of Clyde's corrupted morals or empathy occurs when the whole problem with his sister arises. He chooses not to help her in her dire need, instead throwing away all of his money on a fur coat for his questionable love interest. And of course, he tries to do a similar thing later with Roberta, by not helping her when he really should, especially because in that instance, it was his own fault and therefore his responsibility. At the beginning of the story, we feel bad for Clyde, and we're rooting for him to discover the world and enjoy himself after such a miserable childhood. But as the story progresses, he becomes more and more unlikable. His desire for money and status consume him and warp his previous sense of morality. He would rather marry Sandra, who, even though she says later that she does, I would argue, doesn't truly love him. And he doesn't love her either. He just wants all the perks that come with marrying a rich girl. And instead, our sympathy moves on to Roberta, who Clyde abandons despicably, mirroring the image of his practically destitute, pregnant sister, who had also been abandoned by the man who got her pregnant earlier in the story. But when Roberta dies, who do we sympathize with anymore? Even though Clyde hadn't meant to kill Roberta the way he did, he had still planned on killing her somehow, and a big part of the reason he wanted to kill her was just because her pregnancy threatened his shallow pursuit of material wealth. At this point, I loathed Clyde. I hated him, as I imagine everyone else probably would too. But if we think back to Clyde earlier in the story, we still feel a little, tiny bit of sympathy banging around inside, but not for what he's become. And we sympathize at least somewhat with his motive. We all want wealth and high status. He just took it too far, way past the point of moral rectitude. So essentially, the story is a warning to not blindly chase after material wealth, because you'll probably get hurt, or possibly even ruin your life. But the thing is, Clyde's desires are very much like our own, and it's kind of terrifying to think we could find ourselves in a similar situation if we act on it too much. If we just gradually go further and further, we could find ourselves doing something morally reprehensible. Clyde was so sheltered and protected in his childhood, and it can be debated whether or not this is what pushed him further in the opposite direction, but I think it's emphasizing more the fact that if someone with as strong a moral code as young Clyde could eventually turn into essentially a monster, then it can happen to literally anyone. And I think this brings up another point I'd been thinking about. Clyde doesn't seem to develop much in terms of maturity. Is this because of him chasing his dream without thinking about other things? Is Dreiser calling these money chasers inherently immature? Or is this just a device to show that, in these kinds of situations, your immaturity will ultimately lead to your failure, and that alone should deter you from pursuing it further? Or were these failures simply due to the guilt that tortured Clyde throughout the process? I don't know the answers, I'm just asking. If you've read the book, what do you think? It's also interesting to think about what Clyde was sacrificing to gain wealth and status by marrying Sandra. At that time, being a man, Clyde would have been expected to have been the provider in the relationship, but he seems perfectly willing to push that aside. Sandra even gives him money to pay for things for her in public so it would appear normal, though Clyde doesn't ask for her to do that. And Sandra panders to him in other ways as well. She uses so much baby talk with him that it sounds almost demeaning, like Clyde is a little puppy, and that certainly would have been a hit to any man's pride and masculinity. But Clyde's pursuit of wealth has practically erased his dignity as a man, and he is content simply to reap the benefits of money. I also found it interesting that all the rich people in the novel are not presented as being bad people. The closest would be Gilbert, but you can easily dismiss him as just being young and immature, and thus prone to jealousy, though not necessarily a bad person. Samuel Griffiths, Clyde's uncle, and the owner of the factory, is not a bad person. Maybe a little bit of a hypocrite, but certainly not the ruthless business tycoon you might expect. At least, that's not the side of him we're shown. Sandra, too, is not a bad person. More than a little silly, yes, but harmless. Her family is overly concerned about status, but we don't see them do anything explicitly immoral. On the other hand, Clyde, the one who wants to aspire to be like them, uses blatantly immoral means, including abortion, which at the time would have been more than frowned upon. It was a criminal act. Not to mention his plan to murder Roberta, and thus the unborn baby as well. And the other bellboys in the first part of the book had questionable morals as well, going to prostitutes, getting drunk during Prohibition, and especially fleeing the scene after running over and killing a child. Though I suppose it's possible to interpret this as simple immaturity, but I think it serves a different purpose, to more clearly show this divide of the characters. But what that line actually means, I'm not too sure. Once again, let me know in the comments. I want to hear your theories if you have any. But Dreiser's overall commentary is that those people in the 1920s, or even before then, that became so obsessed with achieving high status and material wealth, often sacrificed their morals to do so, no matter how strong their personal moral code had been. Such a desire can consume you, and cause you to do unspeakable things like Clyde did. Especially echoing the religious overtones in the last part of the novel, doing what Clyde did was essentially selling your soul. I find it an interesting topic since many people are fascinated by the luxury and glamour of wealth in the 20s, without thinking too much about the cost of chasing after it. I think you could compare An American Tragedy loosely with The Truth About Breaking Into the Movies articles I covered a while back, but in more graphic and disturbing detail. Like I said before, some have criticized the beginning of the book for being too long, and that it takes too long to get to the murder and the main plot. I definitely wouldn't agree with that, and I think if something should be cut, it should be the courtroom scenes. They go on for like 200 pages or something like that. It does feel like you're experiencing it in real time, but those scenes alone are almost novel length in themselves. I didn't hate them, but after a while it just kinda dragged a little for me. I don't know, maybe it doesn't matter. I mean, it is the climax of the story, sort of. So maybe it should be as long as it is. What do you think? So those were just some of my random thoughts after my first read-through of the book. There's a lot to unpack in this novel, and I usually don't do this kind of literary analysis kind of thing, but I hope this was at least somewhat interesting. I highly recommend reading An American Tragedy if you haven't already, for an interesting take on 1920s culture, ideas, and desires. But be warned, like I said before, it's a long book. But I will say that it reads very smoothly. The style is very modern, with some old-fashioned words thrown in here and there. Even though it's so long, I was really engaged and sped through the pages. I know that this novel isn't really that famous anymore, so this video probably won't get a lot of attention, but it really should be talked about more. It's fascinating. If you haven't read it already, give it a try, watch this video again, and leave a comment. Did you agree with my comments and observations, or do you have something to add? Please let me know. I want to hear other people's thoughts. Let me know if you'd like to see another book analysis video. I really just made this one because I read it for fun and thought, hey, I might as well make some kind of video about it. Well, anyways, that's all for now, all you sheiks and gals out there, but stay tuned for more tales from the Jazz Age.